In this video, we will learn about for loops in C++. A for loop allows us to execute code repeatedly. Let's write out our first for loop, and then I will explain it step by step. We will create a for loop that starts out at int I equals 0, runs while I is less than 5, and increments I by 1 each time. Inside of the for loop, we will output I, and then a space to the console. Okay, before we run this code, let's break it down. The first part of the for loop is the start value. I less than 5 is the stop value, meaning that this for loop will run while the value of I is less than 5. And the third part of the for loop is the step value, how much we want to change I by each iteration of the for loop. When we run the code, notice that the for loop is run when I has a value of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In this last example, we looked at a for loop that starts out with I at a low value and increases I on each iteration. In contrast, we can have a for loop that starts with I at a large value and decrements I down to a smaller value each iteration. Let's create a for loop that starts integer I at a value of 3, runs while I is greater than 0, and decrements I by 1 each time. Inside of the for loop, we will output the value of I, and then a space to the console. When we run the code, notice that 3, 2, and 1 were output to the console. 0 was not output since this for loop stops executing when I stops being greater than 0. Another important use of for loops is iterating over a sequence of values. Recall that a string is a sequence of characters. This next example will make use of strings, so let's include the string header file at the top of the program. Let's create a string variable s that we assign a value of the string abcd. Then we will have a for loop that starts at int I equals 0, runs while I is less than s.length, and increments I by 1 each time. Inside of this for loop, we will output the value of s at index I to the console. When we run the code, notice that each of the letters A, B, C, and D in the string were output to the console. It is also possible to nest for loops in C++, in other words, to have a for loop inside of another for loop. For this example, let's create a for loop that starts at int I equals 0, runs while I is less than 3, and increments I by a value of 1 each time. Inside of this for loop, we will output a new line, then the string I equals, and then the value of I, then a new line, and then a tab to the console. Inside of this for loop, we will have another for loop that starts at int j equals 0, runs while j is less than 3, and increments j by a value of 1 each iteration. Inside of this for loop, we will output j equals, then the value of j, and then a space to the console. When we run the code, notice that the outer for loop gets executed, making I 0, and then the inner for loop executes. The outer for loop does not resume to set I to a value of 1 until the inner for loop has completed its iterations. This is the behavior of nested for loops in C++.